Welcome to you all to our first ever online World Down Syndrome Congress. And I'd like to thank the Dubai Association for hosting this very important event. I'm Penny Robertson, but before I answer the question of the how and the why of inclusion, let me introduce my daughter, Shona, to you. She has been my inspiration, my motivation, and my exhilaration. So firstly, I want to tell you a little bit of my story. In 1994, we went to live in Indonesia. And when I tried to enroll my daughter in a school there, I found that I, along with a lot of other parents whose child had been locked out of existing international schools, were in the same boat simply because their child had a disability. One principal even told me that she couldn't come to the school because she was handicapped. And my response to him was that she has a disability, and by not allowing her to be enrolled, he was the person handicapping her. At that time, in 1994, there was a very heavy demand for places in these schools, which resulted in the exclusion of many students with disabilities. The schools considered it just too much trouble to cater for the additional needs of learning support. So after many meetings with many parents, I borrowed $25,000 to pay the rent on a building, and we opened a school with 5 teachers and initially just 11 students, one of which was my 14-year-old daughter with Down syndrome. And she was, I should add, the only student at that time with special needs. However, 6 months later, the school was full. So this shows you the demand for good educational services at that time in Indonesia certainly existed. There was no other inclusive school in Indonesia in 1996, and unfortunately the situation has only marginally improved. This raised the question of why has this situation only marginally improved when existing research suggests, conclusively suggests, I'd that inclusive education is not just better for children with Down syndrome, but in fact it's better for all people with a disability, and it can have significant positive impacts on the whole classroom. So despite a number of policy commitments and initiatives at local and national level, we've only seen limited progress moving towards totally inclusive education. My aim has been to make the AIS school the centre of excellence and a model for other schools in Indonesia and in the world. This is central to our school's mission, and it's written in our founding document. And we take it seriously, the collective fit of our staff as our agents of change to deliver our founding principles. And you can see from previous photo that the Australian, or just go back there, that's the Australian International School in Bali, and that's the new school in Jakarta. After 25 years, we've managed to get new campuses in both those places, and neither school excludes any student who wishes to come through the door, and we now have about 15% of our student body as students with disabilities. So now I want to go on to what you should expect from your school. And I want to give you 4 requirements to ensure that your child has a successful and totally inclusive experience in education. Firstly, inclusive education requires clearly articulated and agreed statement of educational outcomes and teaching methodologies. Short-term and long-term goals are important. Timelines and reporting procedures are necessary and may be more frequent than other class members, but certainly not less frequent. Individualized tasks are essential, as they should be for all children. Tailored programs require clearly enunciated learning goals and a baseline against which to assess progress for all those concerned with the child's education. It's very important that parents are involved and that they feel, sorry, I've got the slides out of order, empowered to question what is offered and that they have input into the child's learning. It is the responsibility of the schools to ensure that they commit to best practice and that they implement conclusions of sound research. Your teachers will all be overworked, especially after the last year, and probably underpaid, but that does not mean that they need not be interested in new research findings. As parents, you will find individual staff members have different approaches. But hopefully they will be delighted to have new information presented to them and to become partners in managing, monitoring, and celebrating the achievements of their students with individual learning needs. The evidence for inclusive education is substantial. It's been shown to have short and long-term benefits for all students, both those with and without disability. In inclusive classrooms, research has shown that students with disabilities develop stronger skills in reading and mathematics. They have higher rates of attendance, and they are less likely to have behavioural problems and more likely to complete secondary school than students who have not experienced inclusion. As adults, students with disability who have attended inclusive educational institutions are more likely to be enrolled in post-secondary education and to be employed and to live independently. All very good reasons for inclusive education. Even the crow agrees. Inclusion needs to be authentic, not tokenistic. It should include everybody and it should involve everybody. Students with Down syndrome need to be part of the sports carnival, part of the assembly, part of doing lunch duties, part of every aspect of the school experience. So to reiterate, every child has a right to an inclusive education. Every child has a right to be accepted, and every child deserves to be respected and inclusion. Inclusion should be an expectation throughout the entire school system. It's not just meant for preschoolers or early primary students, but unfortunately we often find that it stops after a student transitions to one school or even to a different teacher. It must be institutionalized throughout the whole educational system. To do that means that best practices must be communicated from the top down. It is unsustainable and exhausting when it comes from the bottom up. Parents feel unsupported when confronted by a system which says there's no longer a space for their child. And for this reason, it is a responsibility of principals, professionals, and all teachers to support families when they are offered a place in a mainstream school, whatever the age or level of the student. When the school is not supportive, then you need to lobby the system or the government, as you will now find that most likely your government has already signed up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Inclusive settings lead to greater learning and better social outcomes than programs undertaken in segregated settings. Secondly, successful programs require a strong group of parents united in their desires and goals for their children. It is a collective responsibility. It's a collective social responsibility. And you will find other parents who are prepared to support you, even though you may feel often that you're just on your own. I know a number of years ago in Jakarta, we had parents trying to enroll their student without making us aware of the issues that they had to face with their child. And in fact, more than that, they denied that there was any special needs requirements at all. So this is usually because, and in this case certainly was so, that they were scared that their child would be refused admission if the child's disabilities were divulged. So trust and good communication between the school and the family is essential. Moving on to the third point, it is important to have a staff which is receptive and led by leaders who are committed to inclusive education. Research has repeatedly identified this as the most important aspect of all in determining how successful the child's educational experience will be. The most productive practices involve a close and collaborative relationship between parents and all staff involved in the student's education. And this relationship is extremely important. In Indonesia, children with disabilities were routinely hidden away, and it required a quantum leap to gain bureaucratic acceptance of an education system of which Indonesian bureaucrats had no experience. My daughter was often the first person with Down syndrome that most of the authorities with whom I had to deal with had ever met. But I should pay tribute to them, as almost to a person they showed interest and a understanding of the need to foster a more progressive and humanitarian approach. And they assisted me through the process of registration, licensing, etc. for the new school from go to woe. That's now 25 years ago. And even then, more dedicated and visionary bureaucrats could see benefits for the Indonesian community. Today, some schools in Indonesia have committed to inclusive education, but like everywhere else, progress has been slow. Our experience has been that students with special needs bring something special to every school, and over 25 years of our school has grown to have a totally accepting, empathetic, caring and supportive attitude to all students. We rarely, if ever, see incidents of bullying in the school because bullying is just something that all students know is not part of who we are, as you can see in the joy in the faces of several students in this slide. And fourthly, parents and educators must have the ability to lobby effectively at every level of administration and government. As parents, we need to engage in lobbying the moment we encounter unfairness and discrimination, whether it be in your neighbourhood school or in government policies and practices. Today, it is a matter of intense pride that some of the lobbying is now done by our own self-advocates and people with Down syndrome. It was self-advocates and parents who brought about the recognition of the rights of people with disabilities by the UN in 2006. And it was parents who brought about the recognition of the particular needs of people with Down syndrome by the United Nations in 2012. So now we have Worldwide Down Syndrome Day on the 21st of March, as in Trisomy 21. Recognised by communities worldwide. And this has ensured major progress in the acceptance of rights and recognition of people with Down syndrome the world over. These guidelines relate to Article 24 on education in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 4 on education, of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as you can see on your screen there. And I now want to go on to the international guidelines that Down Syndrome International have prepared for inclusive education for learners with Down syndrome. Under the UNCRPD, there are 3 rights concepts that apply to education, and they are inclusive education, the right to inclusive education, the right to lifelong learning, and the right to equal opportunity. Under the guidelines that DSI has presented, it spells out very clearly that access to inclusive education is a human right. It benefits everybody. It improves learning for all, and it promotes understanding, and it reduces prejudice. It strengthens social interaction and integration, and it improves the well-being and quality of life for learners with Down syndrome throughout their lives. It also opens up opportunities for people with Down syndrome to contribute economically and socially to their community. These guidelines are set out under guidelines for leading, guidelines for teaching, and guidelines for learning. In short, in summary, inclusion in education leads to inclusion in the community. Segregation in education leads to segregation in the community. The Down Syndrome International Guidelines are written in a manner which should support you to advocate on behalf of your child in the community. And during the last 2 years, COVID-19 has ensured that many students have been homeschooled and undertaken online learning. And not surprisingly, we have seen that students with special needs are the ones who have suffered the most. During schooling, they have needed more social support in order to feel part of the learning community, to be engaged in their learning, and to feel less socially isolated. So let's hope that the worst of COVID is over. So now, returning to the international guidelines, I'm suggesting that you visit the Down Syndrome International website, which is int.org. That's ds-int.org, and download a copy of the guidelines if you have not done so. They will give you the knowledge that you may need to become an effective advocate. And that brings me to the most important point. Now we need to add your voices to the ever-growing call of quality inclusion for all. We have an accurate, up-to-date, evidence-based global consensus document which provides the information and recommendations of particular relevance and importance for the provision of best practice education for learners with Down syndrome of all ages around the world. So I implore you to join with us so that together we can make a difference. Thank you.